The crystal wine glass shattered in David's grip, sending shards and red wine across our pristine white tablecloth. His face had gone from smug to ghostly pale in seconds as he stared at his phone, reading the email that had just destroyed his perfectly controlled world. But let me back up. My name is Alexandra, Alex Chen, and until that moment, I've been just another trophy wife in David Walker's carefully curated life. At least that's what he thought. This has to be a joke, he muttered, still staring at his phone. There's no way. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring both its rich flavor and the moment I'd been orchestrating for the past 2 years. Something wrong, honey? I asked, keeping my voice sweet and concerned, the same tone he'd used to patronize me countless times before. David's eyes snapped up to meet mine, a storm of confusion and anger brewing behind them. The board just called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning. Apparently, there's been a major shift in shareholding. I dabbed my napkin delicately at the corner of my mouth, hiding my smile. Oh, that sounds serious. Should I be worried about our lifestyle? I mimicked the vapid concern he'd always expected from me. 5 years ago, when I first met David Walker, I was running what he called my cute little online shop, a handmade jewelry business that had started in my garage. What David never bothered to learn was that by the time we met, that cute business was grossing 7 figures annually. He was too busy being impressed with himself, his position as CEO of Walker Technologies, and his family's 3 generations of business success to notice what was right in front of him. I still remember our first date. He'd taken me to some overpriced restaurant, spending the entire evening talking about his latest acquisition, a smaller tech company he'd basically strong-armed into selling. Sometimes the little fish don't realize when it's time to let the bigger fish take over, he'd said with that characteristic smirk I come to know so well. I should have seen the red flags then, but I'll admit, I was charmed. David could be incredibly charismatic when he wanted to be. He had a way of making you feel like you were the center of his universe, until you weren't. The changes started slowly after we got married. Comments about how I should probably wind down my business now that I was a Walker. Suggestions that my time would be better spent organizing charity galas and attending country club events. It's what's expected, he'd say, as if that explained everything. I played along, slowly decreasing my visible involvement in my jewelry business. What David didn't know was that I'd hired a brilliant operations manager named Maya Santos, who was running the day-to-day while I focused on expansion. Every time David made a condescending comment about my little hobby, I'd smile and nod, then go make another 7-figure decision. But it wasn't until last year that I saw David's true colors. We were at dinner with his board of directors, a quarterly tradition where the wives were expected to sit quietly and look decorative. I was half listening to another tedious conversation about golf when I heard something that made my blood run cold. The Chen Tech acquisition is almost complete, David was saying, swirling his whiskey. They don't know it yet, but by this time next month, they'll be begging us to buy them out. Chen Tech, my father's company, the business he built from nothing after immigrating to this country with nothing but dreams and determination. The company my brother now ran since our father's passing 2 years ago. I kept my face carefully neutral as David continued, outlining exactly how he planned to systematically destroy my family's company until they had no choice but to sell to Walker Technologies at a fraction of its worth. My brother James had mentioned some troubling business developments, but I hadn't connected the dots until that moment. That night, after David had fallen asleep, I made 2 calls. The first was to James. They're orchestrating it, I told him, speaking quietly in my home office. David's behind everything. The canceled contracts, the supplier issues, all of it. James was silent for a moment. Are you sure, Alex? This is your husband we're talking about. I'm sure. I heard him bragging about it tonight. James, he has no idea who I am, who we are. He never even asked about my family beyond the basics. He just assumed because I run a cute little online shop that I couldn't possibly understand his world of high-stakes business. The second call was to our family's longtime attorney, Sarah Kim. I need to know exactly how much liquidity we can generate quickly, I said, and I need to know how many shares of Walker Technologies are potentially available. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Alex, are you thinking what I think you're thinking? David's about to learn why you should never underestimate the little fish. Over the next year, I executed my plan with surgical precision. My jewelry business had always been profitable, but few people knew exactly how profitable. I'd been banking money for years, living well below my means despite David's insistence on an extravagant lifestyle. I had millions in liquid assets, and James was ready to match whatever I could put in. Sarah helped us set up a series of shell companies, each purchasing small amounts of Walker Technologies stock through different brokers. David was so convinced of his own superiority that he never noticed the subtle shift in shareholding. His family had maintained ironclad control of the company for 3 generations. Why would he worry? What David didn't know was that his own board members had grown tired of his aggressive tactics and arrogant leadership style. It wasn't hard for Sarah to quietly approach several of them, suggesting they might want to sell their shares to our shell companies for a premium. Many jumped at the chance. The final piece fell into place last week when David's own sister, tired of being sidelined in the family business, agreed to sell us her substantial holding. That was what had put us over the edge, giving us majority control of Walker Technologies. Now, watching David's face contort with confusion and rage at the dinner table, I felt a strange sense of calm. Tomorrow's board meeting would change everything, but tonight, I decided to enjoy one last evening of being the trophy wife. I'm sure everything will be fine, I said soothingly, standing to clean up the spilled wine. You always say business is about being the bigger fish, right? David barely heard me, already dialing numbers on his phone, trying to figure out what was happening. I left him there, heading up to our bedroom to prepare for tomorrow. In my closet, behind the designer dresses David insisted I wear, hung a crisp new business suit. I ran my hands over the fabric, thinking about my father. He taught me and James everything we knew about business, but his most important lesson had nothing to do with numbers or strategy. Success isn't about being the biggest or strongest, he'd say. It's about being the smartest and most patient. My phone buzzed. A text from James. Everything's ready for tomorrow. Sure you want to handle this alone? I smiled, typing back. I need to do this part myself. See you at the office after. I could hear David downstairs, his voice rising as he tried unsuccessfully to reach various board members. None of them would take his calls tonight. That had been part of the plan. Tomorrow David Walker would learn exactly who he'd married. Tomorrow, the trophy wife, with her cute little online shop, would take control of the company he thought was his birthright. And maybe, just maybe, he'd finally understand why the little fish sometimes turn out to be sharks in disguise. The morning of the board meeting dawned bright and clear. I dressed carefully in my new suit, watching David rush around in a panic. He barely slept, spending most of the night making frantic calls and trying to understand what was happening to his company. I'll see you tonight, I said sweetly as he headed for the door. He barely grunted in response, his mind clearly elsewhere. I waited 30 minutes after he left, then called my driver. There was no need to rush. I wanted to make an entrance. When I walked into Walker Technologies headquarters, the security guard did a double take. He was used to seeing me at company parties, draped in designer dresses and playing the role of the perfect corporate wife. The sharp-suited woman striding through security clearance was someone else entirely. I took the executive elevator to the top floor, where the boardroom was located. Through the glass walls, I could see David at the head of the table, attempting to maintain control of what was clearly becoming a chaotic situation. "This is ridiculous," I heard him shout as I approached. "How could someone acquire this many shares without us knowing?" I pushed open the door, my heels clicking against the polished floor. "Maybe you were too busy being the bigger fish to notice the shark swimming beneath you." The room fell silent. David's face went through a series of emotions: confusion, disbelief, anger, before settling on something close to horror. "Alex, what are you doing here? This is a private board meeting." I smiled, pulling out the chair at the opposite end of the table. "Actually, as the majority shareholder of Walker Technologies, I have every right to be here." Victory dance. Any shares? Sarah Kim, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up and began distributing documents to everyone at the table. "Actually, Mr. Walker, through a series of carefully structured acquisitions over the past year." Chen, "Excuse me, Mrs. Walker," and her partners now control 51% of Walker Technologies shares. David snatched the papers, his hands shaking as he read. I watched as the reality of the situation slowly dawned on him. "This is impossible," he whispered. You run a jewelry business. You don't know anything about." About what, David? About hostile takeovers? About strategic acquisitions? About watching someone systematically try to destroy a company for their own profit? I leaned forward, letting my carefully maintained mask slip for the first time. Like what you've been trying to do to Chen Tech? His face paled. How did you? Chen Tech, founded by Michael Chen, now run by his son James Chen. I paused, enjoying the way his eyes widened as understanding began to dawn. My father and my brother. The board members were watching this exchange like a tennis match, their heads swiveling between us. Most of them had already known this was coming. They'd been part of the plan. But seeing it play out was something else entirely. You never asked about my family, David. You never showed any interest in who I was beyond the surface. You were too busy congratulating yourself on landing a trophy wife who knew her place. Did you never wonder why I kept my maiden name in business? David's hands clenched into fists on the table. This is manipulation. Fraud. No, Sarah interjected smoothly. Everything was done completely legally. We have documentation of every share purchase, every transaction. Your own sister was quite happy to sell her shares once she understood the plan. Jessica? David's voice cracked. You went to my sister. She was tired of being sidelined, David. Just like you've tried to sideline me. The difference is I didn't let you. I stood up, smoothing my jacket. Now, I believe we have some business to discuss. First order. Effective immediately, David Walker is removed as CEO of Walker Technologies. You can't do this, he sputtered. This company has been in my family for generations. Actually, she can. One of the board members, Richard Torres, spoke up. We've already voted. The motion carries. David looked around the table, seeing nothing but averted eyes and firm expressions. These people had worked with him for years, tolerating his arrogance and aggressive tactics. Now they were finally free to show how they really felt. As for Chen Tech, I continued, Walker Technologies will be issuing a public apology for its recent aggressive actions, and all hostile activities will cease immediately. Furthermore, we'll be exploring potential collaborative opportunities between the two companies, assuming my brother is interested in working with us. The door opened and James walked in, impeccably dressed in his own business suit. I think we can work something out, sis. David's head whipped between us, his face growing redder by the second. This whole time, our entire marriage, was real, David. At least it was for me in the beginning, but you couldn't see past your own ego long enough to know who you were really married to. You thought having a wife with a cute little business made you look generous, progressive. Instead, it made you careless. I nodded to security, who had been waiting outside. Please escort Mr. Walker out. His personal belongings will be packed and delivered to him. As they led him toward the door, David turned back. This isn't over, Alex. Actually, it is. Oh, and David. I smiled, remembering all the condescending comments, all the times he dismissed my business acumen. The jewelry company you thought was so cute. It's worth more than Walker Technologies is right now. Turns out some little fish are better at business than you thought. After he was gone, I turned back to the board. Now, shall we discuss the future of Walker Technologies? I have some ideas about modernizing our approach. The meeting lasted for hours. By the end, we had outlined a new direction for the company, one that focused on innovation and collaboration rather than aggressive takeovers. The board members seemed relieved by the change in leadership style. James stayed afterward, perching on the edge of the conference table. That was quite a show, sis. Dad would have been proud. I felt tears prick at my eyes for the first time that day. You think so? Are you kidding? His daughter just orchestrated one of the most brilliant takeovers I've ever seen, while also protecting the company he built. He's probably up there somewhere doing a victory dance. I laughed, feeling the tension of the past year finally start to release. I just wish. I paused, collecting my thoughts. I wish David had been different. I really did love him, you know. In the beginning. James squeezed my shoulder. I know, but he showed you who he really was, and you showed him who you really are. That's worth something. As we left the office that evening, I saw my jewelry company's logo reflected in the glass windows next to Walker Technologies' sign. Two companies, both built on hard work and determination, both part of my legacy now. David had always talked about being the bigger fish, but he'd never understood a fundamental truth. In business, like in life, it's not about size. It's about wisdom, patience, and knowing exactly when to strike. The media storm hit exactly as I'd expected. Walker Technologies hair ousted by wife, screamed the headlines. Business magazines scrambled to profile me, suddenly fascinated by the jewelry entrepreneur who'd orchestrated one of the most remarkable corporate takeovers in recent history. I sat in my new office, formerly David's, reviewing the latest quarterly reports when my assistant announced an unexpected visitor. Jessica Walker, David's sister. "That was quite something you pulled off," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "I have to admit, when you first approached me about selling my shares, I thought you were crazy. But you still agreed," I pointed out. She smiled, a hint of old bitterness crossing her face. 3 generations of Walker men running this company, and not once did they consider letting a woman take the reins. David was just the latest in a long line of entitled jerks who thought they knew better than everyone else. I studied her carefully. "Is that why you helped us?" "Partly," she admitted. "But mostly, I was tired of watching David run our family's legacy into the ground. His aggressive tactics, the way he treated people. That wasn't what Walker Technologies was supposed to be about." The next visitor was less pleasant. David's lawyer arrived with divorce papers and threats of litigation. "Mr. Walker is prepared to fight this all the way," the lawyer said stiffly. "He's alleging fraud, manipulation, and breach of fiduciary duty." I let out a small laugh. "Is he? Interesting. Ask him if he'd like me to release the recordings of him discussing his planned destruction of Chantech. I'm sure the SEC would be very interested in his tactics." The lawyer paled slightly. "Recordings? I didn't survive in business by being naive," I said, pulling out a USB drive. "Every dinner party, every board meeting I attended as the trophy wife, I heard everything. And unlike David, I believe in keeping receipts." The divorce proceeded quickly after that. David, it seemed, had finally learned when to cut his losses. The transformation of Walker Technologies began immediately. I brought in fresh talent, focusing on innovation rather than acquisition. James and I worked together to create synergies between our companies, proving that collaboration could be more profitable than competition. My jewelry business continued to thrive under Maya's leadership, expanding into new markets and launching a successful digital platform. The irony wasn't lost on me that the cute little online shop David had dismissed was now funding major technological innovations at his former company. 6 months after the takeover, I received an email from David. I almost deleted it, but curiosity won out. "I underestimated you," it read. "I spent so long looking down on what you did that I never looked up to see what you were capable of. For what it's worth, I'm sorry." I didn't reply. Some apologies come too late. A year to the day after the takeover, I stood at a podium announcing Walker Technologies' most successful quarter in company history. Our stock had doubled, our innovation pipeline was full, and employee satisfaction was at an all-time high. "Ms. Chen," a reporter called out during the Q&A, "there are rumors that Walker Technologies is planning to merge with Chantech. Can you comment on that?" I smiled, thinking of the conversation I'd had with James just that morning. Walker Technologies and Chantech will be announcing a strategic partnership next week. Not a merger, a true collaboration between equals. Because sometimes I pause, remembering David's favorite phrase, "It's not about being the bigger fish, it's about making the whole pond bigger." That evening, I sat in my office late, looking at an old photo on my desk. It showed my father standing in front of Chantech's first office, a tiny storefront he rented with his life savings. His smile was proud but humble, his eyes full of dreams. "You were right, Dad," I whispered. "Success isn't about power or dominance. It's about vision, integrity, and the courage to swim against the current." My phone buzzed. A text from James. Dad would have loved this. Both his children running successful companies, working together instead of against each other. "You change everything, sis." I looked out at the city skyline, where both the Walker Technologies and Chantech logos shone brightly against the darkening sky. David had taught me one valuable lesson, though. Not the one he'd intended. Never underestimate someone just because they don't fit your idea of what success looks like. The jewelry business he'd dismissed had given me the resources to save my family's company and transform his. The wife he tried to sideline had become the architect of his downfall. And the woman he'd seen as nothing more than decoration had rebuilt his family's legacy into something better than he could have imagined. Sometimes the biggest victories come not from destroying your enemies, but from proving them wrong in ways they never saw coming. As I gathered my things to leave, I passed David's old office, now a collaborative workspace where teams from both companies could work together. The plaque outside bore a new quote, one my father had always loved. Success is not about the size of the fish, but the wisdom to know when to swim together. David had never understood that. But as I watched our companies grow stronger together, I knew I'd learned the lesson he never could. True power isn't about control, it's about creation. And I was just getting started.